She was so certain she was right that she demanded the DNA test herself. She walked into that Miami courthouse and filed the paperwork herself. She signed her own name on the document that would destroy 9 years of deception. Sandra Webb did not need help ending her own lie. She ended it herself. This is the story of the most expensive mistake a woman ever made out of pure overconfidence. James Porter found the legal notice on a Tuesday evening mixed in with the electric bill and a takeout menu, the way documents that change your life often arrive. Ordinary envelope, ordinary mail slot, extraordinary contents. He stood in the kitchen of his Hialeah apartment, construction boots still on, and read it twice with the focused attention of a man who does not panic and does not catastrophize, but reads what is actually written before reacting. Sandra Webb was filing for increased child support. She was citing Emma's growing educational needs, extracurricular costs, and the general increase in cost of living in Miami. The filing was methodical and thorough. Sandra had always been methodical when she wanted something. James set the notice on the kitchen counter beside his keys and made a cup of coffee and sat at the table and thought about 9 years. 9 years of monthly payments made faithfully without a single missed date. 9 years of every other weekend visits that Sandra somehow always managed to complicate without ever giving him legal grounds to file against her. 9 years of Emma with her mother's green eyes and her mother's easy confidence, calling him dad with the uncomplicated certainty of a child who had no reason to think otherwise. He had never formally questioned Emma's paternity. He had thought about it once, briefly and uncomfortably, in the very early years. Emma had arrived less than 9 months into their serious relationship, and James had never quite been able to work out the timeline in a way that fully satisfied the construction supervisor in him who measured everything twice. But he had chosen to let it go. He had been in love. He had let it go. Now Sandra had chosen to make him do math again, and James Porter had always been very good at math. Michael Grant's Brickell office had the organized confidence of a man who had been winning Miami family law cases for 25 years. He was heavyset in the comfortable way of someone who had stopped worrying about it. With reading glasses he removed whenever he was making a point he needed James to retain. He listened to James's account, the notice, the 9 years, the timeline that had never quite added up, and made notes with the economy of a man who had heard this story in various forms hundreds of times. "She's made an error," Michael said, removing his glasses. "By filing for increased support, she has reopened the full matter for examination. That gives us grounds to request paternity establishment as part of the response. Standard procedure when paternity has never been formally established by court order." He looked at James steadily. "I will request a certified DNA test. She has 2 options. She can refuse, which will look extremely problematic to the court, or she can agree, in which case we find out the truth." He paused. "My experience tells me a woman filing this confidently is a woman who is certain of the result." "She'll agree," James said without hesitation. He knew Sandra. Her confidence was not a performance, it was bone deep. The absolute certainty of a woman who had carried a secret for 9 years without it ever threatening to surface. She would not see a DNA test as a threat. She would see it as a weapon. "Then let's let her use it," Michael Grant said, and put his glasses back on. Sandra's attorney called Michael Grant's office on a Thursday to formally agree to the paternity test. Michael forwarded the confirmation to James in 2 words: she agreed. James was on a job site in Doral on a Wednesday when the text arrived, standing in full Miami sun with blueprints rolled under one arm. He read it once, slid his phone back in his pocket, and returned to the blueprints without changing his expression. His foreman, who had worked with him for 6 years, noticed nothing different about him for the rest of the afternoon. That was how James Porter operated. He processed things internally, thoroughly, and did not perform his reactions for an audience. He thought about Sandra's confidence.
It had been one of the things he found attractive about her in the beginning, the absolute ease with which she occupied a room. That same confidence was what made her agree to the test without apparent hesitation. In her mind, she was not agreeing to something dangerous. She was agreeing to a formality that would confirm what she already knew and silence any doubt James might have been building toward. He had learned across 20 years of construction work that the most dangerous moments on a site were never the obviously dangerous ones. They were the moments when someone was so certain everything was fine that they stopped looking for the problem. Those were the moments that ended careers, sometimes more than careers. He rolled the blueprints back up, called instructions to his foreman, and stood in the Doral afternoon sun, waiting for Sandra's certainty to meet the facts.
The DNA collection appointment was at a certified laboratory in Coral Gables on a Wednesday morning. James arrived at 9. Sandra arrived at 9:15 with her attorney, because Sandra never went anywhere significant alone if she could arrange an audience. She looked exactly as James expected, completely put together, wearing the expression of someone performing a formality they already know the outcome of. She gave James a brief professional nod in the waiting room. He nodded back. They sat on opposite sides of the room, filled out separate forms, and were called back separately for collection. The technician handled everything with brisk competence. James watched the process with the same attention he gave anything technical, not anxious, simply present. Cheek swab, labeled, sealed, documented. He signed the chain of custody form with his precise construction supervisor's signature and walked back to the waiting room. Sandra was already gone. She had not waited. James sat in his truck in the Coral Gables parking lot for a few minutes before driving back to the site. He thought about Emma, 9 years old, blonde, with Sandra's green eyes. He thought about what the result would mean for Emma, regardless of what it said about him and Sandra. He thought about it the way he approached structural problems, starting from what was actually true and working outward from there, without flinching at the answer. The results came through the secure portal on a Monday morning, 11 days after the collection. Michael Grant called at 8:47 a.m. "The results are in," he said. "Are you somewhere you can look at this?" James was in his truck in a Hialeah coffee shop parking lot, engine running, air conditioning cutting the Miami humidity. "I'm somewhere," he said. Michael sent the secure link. James opened it. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. He sat with it for a long time. The coffee shop barista was arranging chairs on the sidewalk patio. A delivery truck idled on the street. Miami was going about its morning entirely indifferent to the man in the gray truck in the parking lot who had just watched 9 years of his life formally reclassify itself. James Porter was not a man who collapsed. He was a man who built things, who understood that when a structure came down, you assessed the damage clearly, cleared the site completely, and decided what to build on the same ground. You did not build around damage, you cleared it. He called Michael Grant back. "What happens now?" Michael explained it all clearly. The support filing was now moot, reversed in fact, and grounds existed for recovery of 9 years of payments. Sandra's own filing had handed them everything they needed. James thanked him, ended the call, and sat in the Miami morning with his calloused hands on the steering wheel. 9 years, $112,000. He thought about Sandra's confident nod in the Coral Gables waiting room. He picked up his coffee, took a long drink, and drove to the site. There was work to do. Sandra Webb received the results the same morning. Her attorney called first, a professional courtesy that gave her 45 minutes to process before the world started moving. She sat in the kitchen of her Coral Gables apartment with the results on her laptop screen and thought about the certainty she had carried for 9 years. She had been so certain. That was the part that kept returning to her in those 45 minutes. Not guilt, not grief exactly, but sheer disbelieving astonishment at her own certainty. She had known, she had always known, and somewhere beneath the knowing, she had constructed such a complete narrative of herself as the wronged party, as the mother managing everything alone, that the actual biological fact had been buried under layers of the story she preferred. Her attorney arrived at 11. They sat at the kitchen table with the results between them, and he said carefully and without judgment that the situation had changed significantly and they needed to discuss next steps. Sandra listened the way she listened when she had no other option, completely and without interruption. Outside the Coral Gables apartment, the Miami morning was bright and warm, and entirely unchanged by the fact that Sandra Webb's 9 years of absolute confidence had just cost her everything she had filed to protect.
James kept financial records the way he kept job site documentation, completely, chronologically, and in physical form, as well as digital backup. He had 9 years of child support payment records in a manila accordion file in the filing cabinet beside his desk at home. Every check, every bank statement, every record confirming delivery. He had kept them because he was meticulous about financial documentation, never imagining this was the reason he would need them. He brought the accordion file to Michael Grant's office on a Tuesday afternoon and set it on the desk. Michael opened it, flipped through the first several months, and looked up with the expression of a man who has just seen exactly what he needed. "This is excellent," he said, which from Michael Grant was the equivalent of enthusiastic praise. Michael had also received the discovery documents, records from Sandra's prior relationship that established a timeline placing her other involvement squarely within the conception window. The documents were not surprising. They were simply confirmation of what the DNA had already established. But for the court, they transformed the case from a disputed biological fact into a documented, deliberate deception. "She knew," James said. "It was not a question." Michael confirmed. "The timeline makes it impossible that she didn't." James nodded once and looked at the 9 years of records spread across Michael's desk and thought about what 9 years of certainty cost when the person carrying it was not you. Sandra's deposition took place in Michael Grant's conference room on a Friday morning. James was not present. Michael had advised against it, and James did not need to be there. He had done what he needed to do. Sandra arrived with her attorney and answered Michael's questions in the careful, measured way of someone who understood that every word was being recorded and weighed. Michael described it to James afterward with professional brevity. She maintained that she had been uncertain about the paternity at the time, which the documented timeline contradicted directly. When Michael presented the discovery documents, the records establishing the prior relationship's timeline, Sandra's attorney had requested a recess. They did not make any offers during the recess, but when they returned, Sandra's posture had changed in the specific way that posture changes when a person understands they have run out of road. "She knows what's coming," Michael told James that afternoon on the phone. James was on the job site, standing at the edge of a foundation pour. "Good," he said. "So do I." He ended the call and went back to the pour. The foundation was going in correctly. Everything was going in correctly now. The night before the court hearing, James sat at his kitchen table with the accordion file in front of him and a beer he was not really drinking. He was not nervous. Nervousness was not his natural register. What he felt was the particular focused stillness of a man about to complete something large that he started 9 months ago in a parking lot, reading a legal notice by the light of his phone screen. He thought about Emma. She was with Sandra this week. She had called him Tuesday the way she called every Tuesday, quick, cheerful,
full of a detailed account of something that happened at school that she had apparently been saving specifically for him. He had listened and asked the questions and laughed in the right places and told her he would see her Saturday. She had said, "Okay, bye, Dad," in the way she always ended calls, quick and offhand, the confidence of a child who never doubts the next conversation is coming. He was going to protect that. Whatever the court said tomorrow about biology and money, he was going to protect that Tuesday call. He had already decided. He closed the accordion file, finished the beer, and went to bed. He slept without difficulty, the way he always slept before something important. He had done the work. The rest was the court's job.
Miami Family Court, on the morning of the hearing, had the particular organized energy of a busy urban courthouse. Suits moving through marble corridors, voices echoing, the machinery of institutional justice running at commercial scale. James arrived with Michael Grant at 8:30. They reviewed the morning's plan in the corridor with the quiet efficiency of two people who had prepared thoroughly and had nothing left to refine. Sandra's attorney, a sharp woman named Cheryl Voss, who specialized in making sympathetic cases out of unsympathetic facts, presented the defense with professional skill. She argued Sandra's role as primary caregiver across 9 years, Emma's need for stability, the established parent-child relationship. She acknowledged the DNA result without challenging it. There was no legal utility in challenging science, and instead asked the court to weigh the child's best interest against strict legal technicality. Michael Grant rose when it was his turn and presented 3 things in precise sequence: the certified DNA results, 9 years of payment records organized into a bound exhibit, and the discovery documents establishing Sandra's documented knowledge of the timeline discrepancy. He noted, with the measured emphasis of a man who understood when an irony was legally significant, that Sandra had been the one to demand the DNA test, that she had filed the very motion that triggered her own exposure. The courtroom was still when he sat down. The judge ruled in the unhurried voice of someone who understood her words would echo into several people's lives for years. She ruled in full. Sandra Webb's petition for increased child support was dismissed. Paternity was formally disestablished. James Porter was no longer the legal father of Emma Webb, and the existing child support order was vacated, effective immediately. The court found that Sandra Webb had knowingly misrepresented James as Emma's biological father and had collected child support payments under material misrepresentation for a period of 9 years, totaling $112,000. Full repayment was ordered, with a 60-day deadline for a structured payment schedule submission. James sat at the plaintiff's table and heard every word with the same focused attention he brought to a final structural inspection. He did not show any visible emotion he had not already chosen to show. He received the ruling with a brief nod, the quiet satisfaction of a man watching a correctly built thing hold its weight. Michael shook his hand at the table. "Well done," Michael said, which was the most Michael Grant ever said after a victory. It was enough. Michael Grant shook James's hand on the courthouse steps with the firm satisfaction of a man who enjoys winning the cases that deserve to be won. He outlined next practical steps: the repayment schedule, the documentation James would receive, the separate proceedings regarding Emma's biological father. He was clear and thorough, as always, and James listened and asked 3 specific questions, all of which Michael answered completely. Then Michael put on his sunglasses and walked toward the parking garage, and James was alone on the broad stone steps of Miami Family Court in the bright midday heat. He loosened his tie slightly. He put his calloused hands in his pockets. He looked out at the Miami street,
people moving, traffic, the indifferent urban noise of a city that had been entirely unchanged by anything that happened inside that courtroom this morning. He thought about Emma. He had a decision to make about Emma that had nothing to do with the court ruling and everything to do with what kind of man he intended to be. He had been thinking about it for months. He had already made it, really. He just had not said it out loud yet. He walked down the courthouse steps, got in his truck, and drove to Hialeah. He was going to call Sandra tonight. Not about the case, about Tuesday. James called Sandra on a Thursday evening. He made the call from his kitchen table, his construction boots off, a glass of water in front of him. He was not angry when he called. He had processed the anger in the months between the legal notice and the hearing. In the methodical way he processed everything, completely, privately, and then set aside. Sandra answered after 3 rings. Her voice had lost the confident register he had known for 9 years. She sounded like someone standing on ground she could no longer fully trust, which was accurate. "This isn't about the case," he said immediately. "Michael handles the case. I'm calling about Emma." A pause. "Okay," Sandra said quietly. "I'm not going to disappear from her life," James said. "She's 9 years old, and she calls me Dad, and that is not something I'm going to upend because a test said what it said. That's my decision. I'm not asking for input on it. I'm telling you so Emma doesn't have to wonder." He paused. "She keeps calling on Tuesdays. She keeps coming on weekends. Nothing about that changes. Understood?" Sandra said yes. Her voice was quiet and without resistance. Perhaps she was grateful. James was not particularly interested in which it was. He said goodnight and ended the call and put his phone face down on the kitchen table. He had built the decision the way he built everything, measured twice on a foundation he confirmed himself. The first repayment installment arrived on the 1st of the following month, a bank transfer, precise and automatic, arriving with the same mechanical regularity that James's own payments had maintained for 9 years. He looked at the notification on his phone and noted it in his financial records with the same methodical attention he gave every entry. He was not sentimental about money. It was a fact that had been wrong and now being corrected. He filed it accordingly. What he thought about more than the money was the math, not the dollar amount, though $112,000 mattered in the specific practical ways it matters to a man who earns his living in construction. What he thought about was the 9 years, the hours on the site paying for something built on a false foundation, the Saturday mornings driving across Miami, the Tuesday phone calls that Sandra had arranged and James had kept without ever fully understanding why she always made sure Emma called. He understood now. He did not need to dwell on it. The foundation was clear. The ground was his. He would build from here. Emma came for her weekend the Saturday after the call. The handoff at the door was brief. Sandra and James exchanged the minimum necessary words with the choreography of people conducting a necessary transaction without performing warmth they did not currently have access to. Emma came in with her backpack and immediately announced she wanted Cuban food because she had been specifically thinking about it since Thursday. They went to the place on Calle Ocho that James had been taking her to since she was 5. Emma ate a full plate and delivered an extensive account of a school conflict that had been resolved by a teacher's intervention, with detailed character analysis of all parties involved. James listened and asked the questions that moved the story forward, the way he always did. Afterward, they walked down the block in the warm Miami afternoon. Emma held his hand the way she had since she could walk, entirely unconsciously, as a matter of simple fact, the way children hold hands with people they have always trusted. Her green eyes moved across the street with the bright interest of a 9-year-old who found most things worth examining. James held her hand back. The test said what it said. The court ruled what it ruled. In Miami, on a Saturday afternoon, walking down Calle Ocho with a 9-year-old who wanted Cuban food and had specifically planned it since Thursday, James Porter was completely certain he had made the right choice. Some structures hold their weight regardless of what the original blueprint said. That was simply a fact of building. Sandra Webb filed for more money and signed her own name on the document that destroyed 9 years of deception. Sometimes the most confident move is the most expensive one. James Porter did not just win back his money, he chose who he was going to be on the other side of the truth. If this story moved you, subscribe to Shattered Crown Stories TV, a new story every single day. Justice is always served.